Hello, everyone, and welcome to Worried About Your Next FDA Meeting? Key Tips to Make It a Success, presented by Roe. I'm Rebecca Friend, the publisher of Fierce Markets Life Sciences Group, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Lauren Neighbours, Clinical Research Scientist at Roe, and Dana Minnick, Regulatory Scientist at Roe. You can read their full bios on the right side of your window. I've got just a few technical notes for you before we begin. If you have any trouble reading a slide, please hold and drag the right corner of the slide window to enlarge. Please also disable your pop-up blockers to participate in the interactive parts of the presentation. And if you'd like to download the slide deck, you can click the purple globe at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. And we're going to be following the presentations today with a Q&A session, so please submit your questions during or after the presentations using the Q&A box at the right side of your screen. All right, I think that's all from me. Lauren, please go ahead.
Thank you, Rebecca. Today, Dana and I will present an overview on FDA meetings and share some best practices that we hope will make your meetings successful in the future. Our discussion will focus primarily on FDA meetings with CDER, Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and CBER, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, and not on pre-submission meetings with CDRH, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. However, many of the best practices we will share today are applicable to all regulatory authority meetings. So first of all, why bother to have an FDA meeting? Well, it typically takes approximately 10 to 15 years to bring a product to market. And this includes approximately 3 to 6 years within the pre-discovery and preclinical phase, about 6 to 7 years in the clinic, and then about 1 to 2 years for FDA review and decision on your marketing application. If you have planned phase 4 studies or other post-marketing commitments, this further adds to your development timeline. Thus, it's very expensive to support the lengthy product development process at an estimated $1 billion on average. Additionally, there's a high attrition rate during development, wherein most products fail to make it through the drug discovery phase, and of the few that make it to the clinic, less than 20% of those will actually go on to be submitted for marketing authorization. Because of the high expense and high attrition rate inherent in the product development process, it benefits sponsors to interact frequently and efficiently with FDA to obtain valuable feedback during your development program, as it may increase your chance for successful marketing application submission. So this slide illustrates a survey that was done by an investment firm polling FDA reviewers on the perceived impact of several different review factors on first cycle review performance of marketing applications. In short, the survey results indicated that FDA perceives pre-submission meetings and other FDA communications to be very valuable for a sponsor's product development plan, and the impact of the meetings is great enough that it may reduce the agency's review time of your marketing application. Additionally, FDA meetings may have a substantial impact on your product development timeline. Looking at this slide from 2010 to 2012, sponsors who had a pre-IND meeting with FDA actually developed their products approximately 6 years quicker on average than sponsors who did not have a pre-IND meeting. Furthermore, sponsors who had an end of phase 2 meeting with FDA developed their products almost 2 years quicker on average than sponsors who did not have an end of phase 2 meeting. In other words, taking advantage of these development meetings with FDA may save you time and money during product development and help you get to market sooner. So if you are still not convinced that FDA meetings are critical for your development program, let's take a look at a recent case study example involving the Prevectis Biopharmaceuticals product, PV10. So in 2012, FDASIA, or the FDA Safety and Innovation Act, also known as PDUFA 5, was enacted into law. This legislation helped to develop new pathways and tools to speed patient access to innovative medicines for serious and life-threatening conditions. One of the tools enacted by FDASIA is the Breakthrough Therapy Designation, which is a pathway available for products intended to treat a serious or life-threatening disease and for which preliminary clinical evidence suggests it provides substantial improvement over existing therapies. Requests for Breakthrough Therapy Designation, or BTD, are reviewed by FDA and granted or rejected within 60 days. The agency guidance on breakthrough therapies encourages sponsors to seek advice from FDA prior to sending a formal request for designation. Thus, in December 2013, Prevectis Biopharmaceuticals held a Type C meeting with FDA to discuss their intention to submit a BTD request for PV10, which is a novel oncology drug. The agency ended up granting the Type C meeting, during which Prevectus noted that FDA provided valuable guidance on a number of issues surrounding the approval path of PB10. In an article in News Medical, the CEO of Prevectus noted that the meeting with FDA presented a significant step forward in streamlining the pathway to initial U.S. approval of their product, and that the agency established parameters for submission of the breakthrough therapy request. Had the company decided not to take advantage of the meeting with FDA to discuss their request, they likely would not have received this valuable feedback from FDA on their clinical development plan. So we often see some sponsors are reluctant to meet with FDA any more than what they feel is absolutely necessary, because they aren't exactly sure whether FDA will agree with their development plans or that FDA may make requests to their program that the sponsor is not prepared to address. For these reasons, it's essential to map out your overall integrated product development program well before you begin meeting with FDA to ensure you have outlined your regulatory strategy and identified any potential risks you may foresee along the way. To begin outlining your development plan, you want to begin with an interdisciplinary team made up of clinical, non-clinical, CMC, and regulatory experts, whether they be in-house or external consultants. You also want to involve your labeling and marketing team to understand the marketing demands and expectations for your product, the competitive landscape, and the implications of your clinical program on the marketability of your product. Your strategic development plan should outline at a minimum your product's indication, target patient population, route of administration, and the primary endpoints you plan to evaluate in your proposed clinical studies. The development plan is a living document that should be revisited and revised throughout your clinical program by obtaining interdisciplinary input and agreement to any new or modified strategies being pursued, and by introducing go-no-go rationale at specific pivot points during your program, at which point you determine to either proceed with or terminate the current development strategy based on predetermined criteria. So one strategic tool that can be used to map out your development program is the Target Product Profile, also called TPP, which is a living document that summarizes your drug development program described in terms of labeling concepts. The TPP should describe the overall intent and goals of the product development program, summarize specific current or future studies or existing data, for example, that may be in the literature already, that will be used to justify the intended label claim. It should also outline any additional studies that may be needed to support your program and identify any risks associated with your development strategy that will need to be addressed or mitigated during development. The TPP should also include information on the competitive landscape for your product and the key differentiators between your product and the current competition in the market, making sure to include a comparison to the gold standard for your product. You want to revisit and update the TPP throughout your development program, particularly following major milestones and any decisions for the program. In addition to being a helpful tool during clinical development, the TPP can also serve as the basis for the annotated package insert, also called a label, submitted in your marketing application, and it benefits you to get started on this process as early as possible. So how early is too early to start drafting your TPP? The answer is it's never too early to start drafting your TPP. I actually recommend drafting the TPP prior to your pre-IND meeting to help map out your proposed development plan from beginning to end. However, no matter where you are in program development, even if you're well after the pre-IND meeting, you should consider now the best time to start. Although not strictly mandatory by agency standards, we strongly recommend including the TPP in your pre-NDA or pre-BLA meeting package to help facilitate discussions between the sponsor and the agency on the appropriateness of targeting labeling statements. We sometimes see sponsors include an updated version of their TPP in each FDA briefing document sent to the agency to help begin these labeling discussions very early during development, and this strategy has been used very successfully in the past. So this slide is just illustrating an example of a TPP taking directly from the FDA guidance on industry on target product profiles, and the link is provided on the slide. As previously mentioned, the target product profile should outline the proposed target label language for your product, as well as the specific studies or evidence to support your intended label claims. The guidance actually includes an example milestone table to indicate if and when the TPP has been submitted to the agency for review, as the TPP can be submitted within your FDA briefing document during development meetings, or it can also be submitted separately to FDA for review and input. So this slide outlines the typical concepts that should be considered when developing a target product profile. and you should refer directly to the FDA guidance for additional information to develop your TPP. The guidance includes several tips on the optimal use of the TPP during development and also includes several case studies demonstrating the advantage of using a TPP to help facilitate FDA-sponsored discussions during meetings with the agency. So now I'm going to turn things over to Dana to discuss the different types of meetings that occur during product development.
Thank you, Lauren. Now, there are several opportunities to seek FDA advice relating to your development program. FDA meetings often represent critical points in the regulatory process, and there are procedures in place for timely and effective conduct of these meetings. As depicted in the slide, the arrows represent Phase 1, Phase 2, and Phase 3 clinical programs and how they may align with FDA meetings. A pre-IND meeting is held prior to the submission of a new investigational drug application. There may or may not be existing clinical data for the drug at that point. Additionally, there are several meetings that are scheduled after submission of the request for marketing authorization. There are 3 formal types of meetings that can be requested with the FDA. These include Type A, Type B, and Type C meetings. These meetings can be held in any format, including face-to-face, teleconference, or a written response. Each meeting type is subject to different procedures. Type B meetings are depicted here, are typically referred to as milestone meetings, and these meetings can be requested to discuss your development program prior to submission of an initial IND. That would be a pre-IND meeting. In some instances, an end of Phase 2 or an end of Phase 1 meeting can be requested. An end of Phase 2 meeting is also a very common meeting and an important meeting. That is a Type B meeting, and also prior to submission of a new drug application or biologics licensing application. Those would be a pre-NDA or BLA meeting. The FDA intends to schedule Type B meetings to occur within 60 days of receipt of a written meeting request. Generally, requests for Type B meetings will be honored except in the most unusual circumstances. With the exception of products granted breakthrough therapy designation status, the FDA will not grant typically more than one of each Type B meeting for each potential application. So it's really important to think about planning for these Type B meetings and what information you'll want to have to present to the FDA to make the most of the meetings. It may be appropriate to have more than one of some Type B meetings if you are developing your product for different indications or for unrelated claims. A Type C meeting is a meeting to discuss the development and review of a product that would not fall under the Type A or Type B meeting category. These are fairly common meetings. They are scheduled by FDA to occur within 75 days of FDA receipt of a written meeting request. And again, the sponsor may request a written response, a face-to-face, or a teleconference. The FDA will assess the meeting request and notify the sponsor whether the meeting was granted within 21 days of receipt of the meeting request. And then the last type of meeting is a Type A meeting. And Type A meetings are meetings that are necessary for an otherwise stalled product development program to proceed, a critical path meeting, or to address an important safety issue. Examples of Type A meetings include dispute resolution meetings, meetings to discuss clinical holds in which the sponsor seeks input on how to address hold issues, or in which a response to hold issues has been submitted and reviewed by the FDA, but the FDA and the sponsor both agree that the development is stalled and a new path forward should be discussed. Special protocol assessment meetings that are requested after receipt of an FDA letter in response to protocol submitted under the special protocol assessment procedures as described in the FDA guidance would also occur as a Type A meeting. In addition, post-action meetings requested within 3 months after an FDA regulatory action other than approval, such as a complete response letter would also be considered a Type A meeting. So I'll take a few minutes to talk about pre-IND meetings. A key objective for a pre-IND meeting is to obtain input on your drug development plan prior to submission of an IND. Although this type of meeting is beneficial for any program, it can be particularly important for new chemical entities, for a particular therapeutic area with non-existing guidance to direct the development program, or for therapeutic areas that may qualify as an orphan drug. In preparation for a pre-IND meeting, the sponsor will typically lay out the development plan through marketing. In addition, the initial clinical plan and supporting non-clinical and manufacturing information is described in the meeting information package. Pre-IND meetings are most effective when the non-clinical studies are completed and the clinical trial material has been manufactured to support the initial clinical study. The draft protocol or synopsis is available for review, and the Phase 1 study site has been identified. Having said that, there are additional reasons to have a pre-IND meeting. These meetings can be very effective if they are focused on scientific and regulatory issues, and there are a number of issues that are listed here, including clinical trial design, toxicity concerns, novel formulations, immunogenicity, species selection issues, and other issues. A pre-IND meeting also provides the opportunity to meet with individuals at the FDA that will be reviewing your drug candidate and obtain their insights on your proposed development plan, which enhances the probability of a successful IND. The pre-IND meeting should be timed so that enough information is available for FDA to provide input. It is important to keep in mind that FDA is not a product development consulting firm. Therefore, it's also important to talk to your industry experts and consultants as needed in order to plan your clinical, preclinical, and CMC programs. In doing so, you can build your IND as you assemble your pre-IND meeting package. It's often optimal to request your pre-IND meeting to occur at least 2 to 3 months prior to the planned IND submission so that you'll have optimal time to take into consideration the FDA input that you are seeking. If timed well and the data is presented in the pre-IND meeting package in such a way, you may be able to fold your pre-IND meeting package text, data tables, and figures into your IND, so some efficiencies can be gained there. I have an example here for a pre-IND meeting. In this case example, a sponsor is developing a novel small molecule oral drug for treatment of a rare disease. He has extensively evaluated this molecule in vivo models of efficacy and has shown that the molecule supports the proposed indication and may provide superior benefit relative to commonly used therapies. The molecule was well tolerated in dog toxicology studies with minimal to moderate liver toxicity only seen at the highest dose of 1,000 milligrams per kilogram per day, providing a very nice safety margin relative to the anticipated efficacious dose in humans. In addition, liver toxicity is also monitorable in humans. In the rat, a steep dose toxicity curve was observed with severe toxicity, and the no observed adverse effect level was determined to be 1 milligram per kilogram, providing a very narrow, if any, safety margin. The good news was that the rat toxicity was also monitorable in humans prior to the onset of severe toxicity. The sponsor requested a pre-IND meeting to discuss the initial clinical plan in light of the toxicity data. In the briefing package for the pre-IND meeting, the non-clinical question asked whether the agency agreed that the preclinical development program studies listed were sufficient to support the proposed clinical plan. And then the FDA preliminary responses to the question The FDA indicated that yes, the program appeared to be adequate to support the proposed Phase 1 clinical plan. However, a full assessment will be made upon review of the audited full study reports included in the IND submission. A clinical question asked whether the FDA agreed with the proposed clinical start dose and the dose escalation scheme of the initial clinical study, given that the non-clinical findings were monitorable in humans prior to the onset of severe toxicity. In the FDA written response, the answer was no, given that the severe, although monitorable toxicity was observed in rats, an additional safety margin was needed for the starting dose. In addition, dose escalation to higher dose cohorts may begin after review of safety and pharmacokinetic data for each cohort. To gain further clarification on the clinical plan, the sponsor went ahead with the FDA meeting. The sponsor replied to the FDA that no further discussion was needed for the non-clinical question, but that they would like to have further discussion regarding the proposed clinical plan. The outcome of the meeting was that the sponsor could begin his clinical trial, although the starting dose would be very low. The sponsor asked whether the data could be reviewed by an independent data safety monitoring board. The FDA agreed with this approach. Additional steps were recommended to ensure patient safety, including clearly defined stopping rules and some modifications to the eligibility criteria. The sponsor agreed to the recommendations, and his IND was ultimately cleared. Back to Lauren for some additional meeting discussions.
Thanks, Dana. So I'll just briefly introduce end of Phase 1 meetings. Given this is a more rare Type B meeting, primarily reserved for specific products in expedited development, often via the accelerated approval pathway. So some sponsors may have a combined pre-IND end of Phase 1 meeting, particularly if they have substantial foreign data to discuss with the agency prior to the beginning Phase 2 of development. For products being developed under the accelerated approval pathway, this end of Phase 1 meeting gives the sponsor an opportunity to meet with the agency following completion of their Phase 1 clinical program and prior to beginning their Phase 3 program. In other words, this meeting is often analogous to an end of Phase 2 meeting for typical products, which I'll discuss in a moment. Because of the accelerated timeline, most non-clinical studies should be completed, and CMC work to manufacture your marketed products should be completed or near completion at this time. Because products developed under the accelerated approval pathway often skip Phase 2 of development, this meeting is often an opportunity for a sponsor to discuss the design of their adequate and well-controlled Phase 3 study or studies. So moving on to end of Phase 2 meetings, this is also a Type B meeting that gives the sponsor an opportunity to meet with the agency following completion of their Phase 2 clinical program and prior to beginning Phase 3. At this point in development, non-clinical studies needed prior to Phase 3 should be completed, although you may have some non-clinical studies ongoing, particularly carcinogenicity studies. Additionally, CMC work to manufacture your marketed product should be in progress and may be completed. This meeting should be focused typically on gaining approval of the design and analysis of 2 adequate and well-controlled Phase 3 studies. And know that you typically only have 60 minutes for these meetings. It's often possible to request from the agency to split the end of Phase 2 meeting into 2 meetings, one focused on clinical and non-clinical topics typically, and the other focused on CMC. FDA may downgrade one of the Type B meetings to a Type C guidance meeting, but the request to split the 2 meetings is often granted by the agency. So with respect to the Phase 2 clinical meeting, or portion of the meeting if you only have one, the focus of the discussion should primarily be on the design of your Phase 3 studies. You may also want to get buy-in from FDA on the adequacy of your current or planned safety database to ensure you have sufficient exposure data for marketing authorization. You should also plan to discuss any clinical pharmacology or non-clinical data that supports your current clinical development plan, and also include any additional information that may be needed to support your marketing application submission. At this point, you should also submit a pediatric study plan detailing when you plan to conduct clinical studies in a pediatric population, or alternatively submit a waiver to justify why you don't plan to conduct these studies. For the end of Phase 2 CMC discussion, the focus of the discussion should be to gain agreement from the agency on your drug product and drug substance specifications and stability program, being sure to point out the levels of any impurities that you've discovered in clinical batches and any known toxicology data. You should also plan to discuss any anticipated manufacturing changes for your program to ensure you're meeting regulatory requirements. Now let's look at another case study, specifically looking at an end-of-phase 2 meeting involving validation of a patient-reported outcome scale. So in this example, a sponsor was developing a Me-Too oral drug for pain via the 505(b)(2) submission pathway. At the time of the end-of-phase 2 meeting request, the sponsor had completed their phase 1 and phase 2 clinical studies, and they had no major CMC or non-clinical issues to discuss with the agency. Thus, the focus of the meeting was on the planned phase 3 program and the protocols for their adequate and well-controlled studies. The phase 3 studies that were planned included a novel patient-reported outcome scale, or PRO, which limited data existed in the literature for it, but there was really no real clinical evidence to support the validity of the scale. The sponsor had planned to include a label claim on the effectiveness of the PRO in measuring the subjective clinical endpoint of nociceptive pain. So the main clinical question that the sponsor asked regarding the PRO was, does the agency agree that the proposed phase 3 clinical program is sufficient to support a label claim in the NDA submission for nociceptive pain as measured by the PRO assessment? And unfortunately for the sponsor, FDA's response in brief was simply no. The validity and reliability of the scale has not yet been established in the target population, and the sponsor should provide this evidence prior to conducting phase 3 studies. So in essence, although there was some evidence in the literature to support the use of this PRO in measuring pain as a clinical endpoint, the agency's guidance on the use of PROs in clinical studies to support labeling claims requires the sponsor to demonstrate content validity as well as reliability of the instrument in the target population, and this is often via a specific PRO validation study, for which the sponsor did not have. So now I'll turn things back to Dana to discuss SPAs, as well as late-phase development meetings.
The timing for request of a special protocol assessment is typically in late phase 2 after the conduct of an end-of-phase 2 meeting. Special protocol assessment process is designed to evaluate individual protocols, primarily in response to specific questions posed by the sponsor. There are 3 types of protocols that are eligible for special protocol assessment. These include non-clinical carcinogenicity protocols, final drug product stability protocols, and clinical protocols for phase 3 adequate and well-controlled studies, as well as post-approval efficacy supplement studies intended for label claims. In the request, the sponsor should post focused questions concerning specific issues regarding the protocol design, study conduct, study goals, and/or data analysis for the proposed study. Before submitting a protocol for review and input via the special protocol assessment process, it is important that the sponsor ensure that the FDA is familiar with the product development program. Otherwise, a Type B meeting should be scheduled to educate the FDA. The SPA request letter with a complete protocol in question should be submitted to the FDA 90 days prior to the intended study initiation date. 45 days are allowed for FDA review, or 90 days for FDA review if an external advisory committee is required. The clock restarts with any protocol revision. The sponsor will receive written feedback on the protocol. A Type A meeting can be requested if the feedback is not commensurate with proceeding with the study. It's critical to state that the protocol assistance is not provided post-study initiation. Pre-NDA or BLA meetings are meetings that occur prior to submission of an application for marketing authorization. A pre-NDA meeting is a logistical meeting. It's focused on marketing application submission, and this meeting should be held sufficiently in advance of the planned submission of the application to allow for meaningful response from the FDA, and the feedback to allow for FDA feedback, and should generally be at least 2 months prior to the planned submission. No data is required for this meeting, although oftentimes sponsors will provide data in their meeting information packages. This is the last chance to make the FDA aware of any problematic issues with your data and to gain their input and advice. Meetings are required, pre-NDA meetings are required at least 60 days prior to submission. However, it's best to have them at least 3 months prior. Several important topics to consider for discussion at a pre-NDA meeting are listed in this slide. In general, this meeting should focus on gaining agreement on the content of the complete application for the proposed indication, including preliminary discussions as needed on the need for any risk evaluation mitigation strategies or other risk management actions. There may also be agreement on submission of a limited number of application components no later than 30 calendar days after submission of the original application. These late submissions should not impact the ability of the FDA to begin their review. Examples of these late submission information would include updated drug product stability data, or a final audited non-clinical study report, such as the carcinogenicity report where the audited draft was submitted in the initial NDA submission. Once the NDA is submitted, the FDA will inform the applicant of the planned timeline for review of the application. The information conveyed will include a target date for communication of feedback from the review division to the applicant regarding proposed labeling and post-marketing requirements and commitments the FDA will request. Within 74 calendar days from the date of receipt of the original submission, a letter will be sent to the applicant. This letter will include a timeline along with notification of issues identified during the filing review. Within 74 calendar days from the date of receipt. This letter will include a planned date for an internal mid-cycle review meeting and will include preliminary plans on whether or not to hold an advisory committee meeting to discuss the application. The mid-cycle meeting typically occurs in month 5 or month 3 for priority applications. This is an internal agency review meeting that will be followed by a call to the applicant to review the status of the application. Late cycle meetings occur after the primary reviews are completed in months 9 or 6 for priority, just prior to an advisory committee meeting if an advisory committee meeting is planned. At this meeting, if an advisory committee meeting is planned, the FDA may provide their background package and a proposed list of questions for the advisory committee meeting. Discipline review letters are also sent to the applicant at this time, and major deficiencies are discussed along with the risk management plans. Any additional data or analyses the applicant may wish to share can also be discussed at this meeting. Advisory committee meetings, if there will be one, will occur shortly after the late cycle meeting. This is typically held in a public venue. The applicant provides a briefing package. The agency provides questions to the committee. The public has an opportunity to speak, and the committee will answer the questions and vote on recommendation for the FDA to consider. A wrap-up meeting occurs 7 weeks prior to the action date, or 6 weeks for priority. A labeling meeting is one of the last meetings the applicants will attend. This labeling meeting, although labeling is reviewed throughout the NDA review process, it's typically at the end of the meeting when the reviews are complete that the FDA will have this meeting. This is a very high priority meeting for both the FDA and the sponsor. Back to you, Lauren.
Thanks, Dana. So now we'll step back a minute and really think about the meeting process and whether or not requesting a meeting is really necessary. So if you do not have specific questions to ask the agency regarding your development program, you may not even need to meet with them. To that point, be sure to identify all of the questions you plan to ask the agency well before requesting the meeting and understand your data before drafting the questions. You don't want to haphazardly put together your meeting request and then realize later that you had several additional questions to ask the agency because the agency begins to plan reviewers for your briefing document and attendees at your meeting once the request is received. And it's typically bad practice to substantially change your meeting questions in your briefing document from what you had originally submitted in the request. Thus, it's best practice to prepare your meeting package in advance of sending the meeting request so you know the content of your briefing document will actually support the questions you plan to ask FDA. You should also consider the optimal format of the meeting and whether you prefer to meet with FDA face-to-face or via teleconference, or decide once you've received FDA's preliminary responses to your meeting questions that perhaps the sponsor may actually decide that the written responses are sufficient and actually cancel the meeting. So just a few points on requesting a meeting. When you do request a meeting, make sure to submit the request in writing to the review division, and also remember to copy the office director on the request for a Type B meeting. If an electronic IND is in effect, you should also submit the request as an electronic amendment to your IND. And the timing of the request is dependent on the type of meeting being requested. So for Type A meetings, the request is sent approximately 30 days prior to the meeting. For Type B meetings, the request is actually sent approximately 60 days before the meeting. And for Type C meetings, the request should be sent approximately 75 days prior to the planned meeting date. So this slide lists the key information that should be included in the meeting request. And this is in accordance with the new draft guidance for industry on formal meetings between FDA and sponsors or applicants of PDUFA products. That was released in March of this year. This new guidance replaces the draft guidance from 2009, so keep that in mind in case you end up trying to Google this guidance, that it is a new guidance and it's actually a new title for the guidance. So I won't read through this list, except to note that you'll want to submit your final meeting questions with the meeting request letter and avoid modifying the questions after the request is submitted to FDA, because as I mentioned previously, FDA will actually identify attendees for the meeting based on the questions posed in the meeting request. Make sure when you're planning your agenda that you consider that there are typically only 60 minutes allowed by FDA for the meeting as well, so you want to plan your agenda wisely. Following receipt of the meeting request, the agency will determine whether to hold the meeting, and if so, whether the meeting type requested is appropriate. For example, FDA may grant the meeting, but downgrade from a Type B to a Type C guidance meeting, particularly if you've already used your one allotted Type B development meeting, or if FDA feels you're not at the appropriate stage of development to have the Type B milestone meeting. FDA will respond with their decision on whether to grant the meeting within 14 days of receiving the request for Type A meetings, and within 21 days of receiving the request for Type B and Type C meetings. If the meeting is granted, the date, time, and meeting location, as well as expected FDA participants, will be provided. If the meeting is denied, the reason of denial will be provided. The meeting information package should build on the meeting request letter that was previously submitted to FDA and includes supportive data to help FDA address your questions. Be sure to include clinical, non-clinical, and CMC information in the package as appropriate, but avoid adding too much extraneous information that's not supportive of your proposed meeting questions and agenda. Just a few additional notes. The final meeting package should be fully paginated and include a table of contents, any appendices, and tabs. And your cover letter should identify the date, time, and subject of the meeting. Note you'll need to send paper copies of the meeting package in addition to electronic copies. And typically 3 copies of the meeting package are sent for the IND, which includes 2 reviewer copies and 1 for the document control room. And additional desk copies requested by the regulatory project manager for reviewers should also be sent to the agency if necessary. Similarly to submission of the meeting request letter, the timing for submitting your meeting package depends on the type of meeting requested. So in accordance with the updated FDA meeting guidance, again, that was released in March of this year, meeting packages for Type A meetings should be sent concurrent with the meeting request. In the past, a Type A meeting package could be submitted 2 weeks prior to the meeting date, so this is actually a change in the new guidance. Type B and Type C meeting packages should be submitted approximately 1 month prior to the meeting date. Note, FDA reserves the right to cancel the meeting anytime, but particularly if the briefing package is not received by the regulatory deadline. Pre-meeting rehearsals are extremely important to ensure all important players are prepared for the meeting. During rehearsals, we recommend starting by brainstorming possible FDA questions and answers based on the questions asked of FDA and the data presented in the briefing package, focusing on any potential areas of risk identified for the program. Sponsor attendees should be assigned responsibilities to address these issues based on topic area and expertise during the meeting, and a backup person should be identified to help address the question if the primary person responsible is unable to completely address the question during the meeting. Note, you may consider producing backup slides to help support your responses to specific questions, particularly if there is supportive data or a schematic or diagram to help illustrate your position. We typically recommend at least 2 teleconference rehearsals and a face-to-face rehearsal the day before the meeting. The rehearsals are typically mock meetings where team players play the part of FDA reviewers and the identified responsible parties address the questions as if they were actually at the meeting. The final rehearsal should incorporate Q&A based on FDA's preliminary responses if you receive them. So you should receive FDA's preliminary written responses prior to the meeting, although the timing could be days or even minutes before the meeting. The timing of the responses often depend on the FDA review division. Once you've received FDA's feedback, make sure to thoroughly review the responses and identify any outstanding questions and issues for discussion at the meeting. After reviewing the responses, be prepared to decide whether to proceed with a face-to-face meeting, a teleconference, or alternatively, you may decide to cancel the meeting if you determine the agencies responsible are acceptable and no further clarification or discussion is needed. So on the day of the meeting, be prepared to arrive about 30 minutes early to allow enough time to go through security at FDA. The meeting will typically begin with brief introductions from all meeting attendees, which gives the sponsor and sponsor representatives time to identify the key FDA reviewers at the meeting. The sponsor will typically begin with an introduction that should be approximately 2 minutes maximum. You should presume FDA has reviewed your meeting package, and thus a lengthy overview of your clinical program is not necessary unless specifically requested by the agency, which we have seen. The bulk of the meeting should be spent on the questions that were asked in the meeting request, confirming or clarifying FDA's responses, and coming to agreement, if at all possible, with the agency on proposed paths forward. We recommend as many of the sponsor representatives take notes during the meeting as possible to ensure you have a comprehensive verbatim transcript of the meeting if possible. At the end of the meeting, the sponsor representative should summarize major decisions and action items for the meeting. So after the meeting concludes, you should plan to meet with the team as soon as possible to debrief, discussing any decisions, action items, or major roadblocks that came up during the meeting. You should then draft meeting minutes as soon as possible after the meeting while the experience is still fresh in your mind. We recommend drafting a verbatim transcript initially to be reviewed and vetted internally, and then developing a summarized version of the meeting minutes for delivery to FDA. Be prepared to send your version of the meeting minutes to the FDA Regulatory Project Manager. We recommend within 1 week of the meeting if possible. This increases the likelihood that FDA will use your minutes to draft their version of the official meeting minutes. Keep in mind that FDA is actually responsible for providing the official meeting minutes to the sponsor within 30 days of the meeting. Okay, so I think that summarizes our information, but just to summarize some key points from our talk, make sure to take advantage of opportunities to interact with FDA throughout product development. It may lead to faster development time and also result in a more favorable review of your marketing application submission. We recommend creating a clinical development plan and a target product profile as early in development as possible. You can use these tools to guide your development strategy throughout the life cycle of your product. Please keep in mind that FDA is not a product development consulting firm. Make sure to understand current regulations and FDA guidance documents, which represent the agency's current thinking, and seek help from industry experts where you need it. Also understand the types of FDA meetings and which meetings are available to you. Depending on the type of product you're developing and the regulatory pathway, such as, for example, accelerated approval pathways, which we discussed, you may have more opportunities to meet with FDA than the typical product development pathway. When drafting your meeting request to the agency, do not include open-ended questions. You could be setting yourself up for surprise and potentially disappointment if you give the agency too much control over your development program. And before every meeting with the agency, practice, practice, practice. Even experts who have presented at FDA meetings countless times still need to participate in rehearsals to ensure your meeting with the agency is as successful as possible. So now I will hand things back to Rebecca for the Q&A session.
Okay, great. Really nice presentations there. All right, we've got a lot of questions, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. And here's the first question for you, and either speaker feel free to jump in on this one. As the FDA continues to face a high rate of turnover with regulators and employees who attend these meetings, do you see these as a problem for consistency and carryover to the product timeline?
So, this is Lauren. I can help address this question, then Dana, if you have anything to add. So this is a good point. You know, we can't, unfortunately, we can't control turnover at the agency. It'd be great if we could, but that's why it's particularly important to try to gain agreement with FDA during the meetings, development meetings, as much as possible, and then hopefully you can document those decisions in the final meeting minutes. And that way, if you do have new reviewers come in and they may disagree potentially with the previous reviewers, if you have those decisions documented, then you at least have that documentation to lean on in the future. I'd also recommend including a version of your target product profile or your clinical development plan in your briefing packages sent to FDA so any new reviewers can get a quick overview of your development plan prior to your next meeting. And also keep in mind that if you have a target product profile that you're continuing to revise and develop during your program, you could also help with consistently internally if you have high turnover at your company.
I agree, Lauren. I think it's really critical to make sure that your communications with the FDA are documented, that in addition to potentially, if you feel to send an email to the project manager, always follow up with a formal submission. And it is also important to know that FDA advice at meetings is not binding. They are giving the best advice given the information that they have to date. And there is a possibility that another reviewer will come in with a different viewpoint. And I think that the scientific, providing the best scientific rationale as to why you feel your decision should be a certain way is probably the best approach to entering into discussions where new FDA reviewers may have differing views relative to previous FDA reviewer.
Okay, great. Here's another one for you. And again, either one of you feel free to jump in here. From the FDA's perspective, what are ways to build a relationship, as you referred to in an earlier slide?
I think one of the best ways to building the relationship with the FDA is to really be clear about your intentions and how you intend to develop your therapeutic or your product. And as Lauren had pointed out earlier, the target product profile really provides an excellent opportunity, and FDA can then follow your drug development program along the way and the best way, I think, to build a relationship with FDA during the development process is, as your drug is in development, is to have FDA meetings that are well thought out, that are well timed, that demonstrate that you're thinking about the safety of your patients, because that is a primary concern, as well as how your therapeutic will be positioned for that particular indication. And I think taking the advice, but I think letting the science and the data for your therapeutic drive your drug development program, I think, is one excellent way to build that relationship. I think FDA is very respectful of letting the science drive your product development.
Okay, great. One more for you here. How many regulatory personnel from a company must attend the agency meeting? Is it just the regulatory personnel, or can the sponsor and the investigator also attend the meetings?
I often think that it's depending on the questions that are asked at the meeting. It's important to have the discipline experts present, an expert in chemistry, manufacturing controls, potentially, non-clinical expert, a clinical expert, and perhaps a chief scientific officer, chief medical officer within a company, as well as the regulatory personnel, which may help to summarize the decisions and agreements that are made during the meeting at the end. I don't think there needs to be a lot of personnel from a company that attends the meeting. I think that the questions and content should drive the meeting. I also, however, think it's very important that all attendees at the meeting agree on who's making decisions and commitments, so that although perhaps sometimes a disciplinary expert, a CMC expert, may provide information and background, the CSO or the CEO may be the one who makes the decision on whether or not they want to commit to a particular path. And those decisions about who's making the agreements and the commitments in the meeting, if any, and I think it's very important to realize that the sponsors don't really need to commit to something that they don't feel comfortable committing to at the meeting. They can thank FDA for their advice and ask requests for follow-up as needed, or say that they're going to take that back and take that into consideration, and they appreciate their input. Once you can make a commitment to something, that becomes a matter of, it lives in your IND, so those decisions need to be considered thoughtfully. So whereas you'll probably want to have specific disciplinary experts at your meeting, I think just the types of information that they provide should really be decided and discussed in advance of the meeting.
Mm-hmm. And just to add to that, I would make sure that any attendees that you are planning to have at the meeting attend the meeting rehearsals as well, so they are prepared for the meeting, and if they are slated to address any issues or any questions, that they are thoroughly prepared for the meeting. And if as we know, some sponsors have some folks that like to be very vocal and may or may not take a lot of time to think before they speak. So if you do have any folks on your team who may be potential risks during the meeting with respect to potentially getting upset by an FDA reviewer or a potential issue, consider whether or not you want them to attend the meeting. Perhaps they could call in for a debrief after the meeting. But just keep that in mind as well when you are thinking about who to bring to the meeting.
Right, and along those lines as well, oftentimes you may need to point to a particular table in a briefing document. It is very important to know that no new information should be presented at an FDA meeting. The information that is discussed should be available in the meeting information package. But there are oftentimes an opportunity or a need to have a table. And bringing slides or a slide projector to a meeting or having a PowerPoint is not really the best way to provide that. Having a handout to give to the people in the meeting room, one handout per piece of information, and have a few of those ready in case you decide you want to distribute them so that the reviewers can be looking at the table or whatever piece of information as you're talking about it is very helpful. But you should have those not stapled together, but individually to be distributed on an as-needed basis.
And if you have them, the slides prepared ahead of time, it's often appreciated by the regulatory project manager if you're able to send those beforehand, so that the reviewers have sort of a heads up and may have, a few hours, for example, to be able to review the material before the meeting.
Right. In a lot of instances, and some FDA meetings that I've attended, we will actually spend time, depending on how much time we've had from the preliminary written responses to the time of the FDA meeting, we'll have had time to go back and think about our response to their response. And sometimes we'll draft our response into their response with a couple of clarifying requests for clarification. We'd like further discussion on this. So we'll go back to the project manager before the meeting and we'll say, we don't need any further discussion on questions 1, 3, 6, and 7. However, we would like to have further discussions on questions 2 and 8, and and 5, and here are some of our preliminary responses to your written response, or some comments to your preliminary written responses, and we request further clarification opportunity to discuss them. You may even decide what order you want to discuss them in. Sometimes you may want to make sure you have enough time to discuss a particular you expect a lengthy discussion on that. You may want to put that one first, or you may want to get some earlier questions addressed, or easier questions clarified before you spend time on your lengthy question. Either way you decide to order them, you do have an opportunity to change the order. I think the important thing is that the sponsor, you have 60 minutes or whatever amount of time they give you, and it's really your responsibility to manage the time. It's not theirs.
Okay, great. I think we have time for one more really quick question. I'm trying to pick one out here. And again, we've just got a couple minutes left, so this will be our last question for today. I'm developing a drug for a serious but rare disease for which there are very limited therapeutic options. When is it appropriate to discuss plans for orphan drug designation, fast track request?
I'll take this one. Fast track process is designed to facilitate and expedite the review of drugs to treat serious conditions, and they fill an unmet medical need. And because this request can be initiated by the sponsor at any time during the drug development process, the sponsor can initiate discussions as early as a pre-IND meeting. However, it's important to note that non-clinical and clinical data should be available to demonstrate the potential to address this unmet medical need. And then, in addition, for orphan drug designation, an open IND is not a requirement for this request, and so plans for a request for orphan drug designation can be discussed as early as a pre-IND meeting. And if you do get orphan drug designation approval, you may be able to request someone from the office to attend your FDA meetings as one of the attendees.
All right, great. Well, that is all the questions that we have time for today. Again, I want to thank everyone who submitted questions, and if we didn't get to your question today, we can get back to you individually after the webinar. Again, thank you all for attending this Fierce Live webinar. I want to also thank our speakers for participating and Ro for presenting today's webinar. The webinar has been recorded. You'll be able to access the recording within 24 hours on the same page that you used to register for the event. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.